The air in the lodge was a carefully curated fiction. It smelled of cedar and old money, of leather-bound books that were never read, and bourbon that was always poured. It was the scent of manufactured power, a neutral territory where predators like Theodore and I could circle each other under the guise of a corporate retreat. For 3 days we had been performing. We performed civility in the conference rooms, intellectual superiority on the panels, and bored indifference at the cocktail hours. It was a ballet of aggression, each movement precise, each smile a sharpened blade. Theodore was a master of it. He moved through these spaces as if he'd been born in them, his posture a declaration of ownership. His suits were a darker shade of armor than mine, his handshake a fraction firmer, his laugh a decibel louder. I catalogued these details like a scout mapping enemy territory. Every micro-expression, every subtle shift in weight, every choice of word. It was all data. Data I used to build a fortress around myself, brick by boring brick. My fortress was one of quiet observation, of stoicism. I was the rock he broke himself against, the unreadable variable in his otherwise perfect equations. People mistook my silence for weakness. Theodore, I think, knew better. He knew it was a shield. He just didn't know what I was shielding. Honestly, most days, neither did I. The final session had just ended. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, ugly purple. Snow, which had been a polite dusting all morning, was now coming down in thick, wet sheets, plastering itself against the panoramic windows. The wind was beginning to keen, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the floorboards. A nervous energy rippled through the departing executives. Phones were checked, flights were confirmed, and then canceled. The retreat was officially over, but the mountain, it seemed, had other plans. I saw Theodore near the grand stone fireplace, his back to the room. He was on the phone, his free hand shoved deep into the pocket of his cashmere trousers. Even from across the room, I could see the tension in the line of his shoulders. It was a deviation from his baseline of effortless control, a discordant note in his symphony of success. I filed it away. The lodge manager, a woman with a face etched by years of placating the powerful, stepped onto a small riser and clapped her hands for attention. Her smile was stretched thin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice straining to be heard over the rising wind. "Due to the sudden and severe intensification of the storm, the mountain pass is now closed. All transport is suspended indefinitely." A wave of groans and frustrated curses filled the room. The fiction of control was dissolving. "For your safety," she continued, "we will be consolidating everyone into the main lodge. However, we have a structural concern with the east wing under this much snow load. The engineers are recommending we evacuate it." She paused, scanning the crowd. "Which means we are unfortunately short on private suites." My room was in the east wing. Of course it was. I felt a familiar, cold weight settle in my stomach. The prospect of forced proximity, of sharing space, was a unique kind of horror. My carefully maintained solitude was my primary defense. The manager's eyes found me, then darted to Theodore, who had just ended his call and turned around. His face was a mask of granite, but I saw it, the flicker of something raw in his eyes before it was suppressed. He had heard. "Mr. Liam," the manager said, her tone apologetic. "And Mr. Theodore, your suites are both in the affected wing. We have one remaining cabin available, the presidential suite. It's the most structurally sound building on the property." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to us. The two titans of industry, the public rivals, forced into a shared cage. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and metallic like blood. Theodore's gaze met mine across the room. There was no challenge in it, no corporate posturing, just a flat, weary resignation that mirrored my own. The storm had just stripped us of our titles. We were no longer CEOs. We were just two men trapped on a mountain. The lie we had lived by for years, the professional line between us, was about to be erased by a blizzard, and I had no idea what, if anything, would be left in its place. The cabin was less a cabin and more a miniature lodge, a monument to rustic excess. Exposed wooden beams the size of tree trunks crisscrossed the vaulted ceiling. A fireplace big enough to stand in dominated one wall, a monolithic slab of river rock. The air was cold and still, smelling of pine cleaner and disuse. A golf cart, struggling against the rapidly accumulating snow, had dropped us and our luggage at the door before retreating back towards the main building, its tail lights swallowed by the swirling white. Now the only sound was the howl of the wind and the frantic, percussive beat of my own heart. We stood in the cavernous main room, our suitcases bleeding melted snow onto the polished slate floor between us. The space was a battlefield, and we were two soldiers surveying the terrain, deciding where to draw the lines. "I'll take the loft," Theodore said. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual boardroom resonance. It was the first thing he'd said directly to me all day. I just nodded, my throat too tight to form a response. I watched him haul his ridiculously expensive leather bag up the spiral staircase, the muscles in his back straining against the fine wool of his sweater. He didn't look back. I was left with the master suite on the ground floor, a room with a bed large enough for 4 people and a bathroom clad in cold, unforgiving marble. I closed the door, leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and took a breath. Containment. That was the new objective. Contain the situation. Contain the proximity. Contain myself. I unpacked with methodical precision, arranging my shirts by color, placing my toiletries in a perfect line on the marble countertop. It was a stupid, pointless ritual, but it was mine. A small act of order in the face of encroaching chaos. The professional armor had been breached, but the personal armor, the rigid self-control, had to hold. For hours we existed in separate orbits. I heard the floorboards creak above me, the muffled sound of a shower running. I built a fire, the process of familiar comfort. Crumpling newspaper, stacking kindling, arranging the logs, just so. The crackle and pop as the flames caught was a welcome intrusion into the oppressive silence. I sat on the massive leather sofa, staring into the hypnotic dance of the fire, and tried to read a financial report on my tablet. The words swam before my eyes. My senses were on high alert, every nerve ending attuned to the space beyond my own body. I was acutely aware of him, aware of his presence in the same structure, breathing the same recycled, wood-smoked air. It felt like a pressure change in the atmosphere, a low hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. He came down the stairs sometime after 9. I didn't look up from my tablet, but I tracked his movement by sound. The soft tread of stockinged feet on the stairs, the whisper of fabric as he moved towards the kitchen area, the click of a cabinet opening, the clink of a glass. He didn't get a drink. He just stood there, in the periphery of the firelight, a dark shape against the darker windows. The blizzard raged outside, a solid wall of white noise. The silence inside was heavier, pressurized. "They're saying it could be 2 days," he said. Not to me, but to the room. "I heard," I replied, my eyes still fixed on the screen. It was a lie. I hadn't heard anything. I was just trying to maintain the wall. He moved closer, into the circle of light cast by the fire. He was wearing a gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. His hair was damp from his shower. The scent of his soap something clean and sharp, like sandalwood and rain, cut through the smell of the fire. It was jarringly intimate. He sank into the armchair opposite me, the leather groaning under his weight. He stared into the flames, his profile etched by the flickering light. For the first time, I could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the faint lines around his eyes, the tight set of his jaw. The mask of Theodore, the indomitable CEO, was gone. This was just a man, a tired man. My carefully constructed fortress began to feel less like a defense and more like a cage. "There's whiskey," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. A peace offering, a rule violation, an act of sheer, stupid humanity. He turned his head and looked at me. Really looked at me. His eyes, which I had always catalogued as a cold, strategic blue, seemed darker in the firelight. Deeper. It wasn't the gaze of a rival. It was something else. Something that saw past the suit, past the silence, past the shield. It was the first crack in the armor. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. And he turned back to the fire. The night wore on, measured not in hours but in the logs I added to the fire. We didn't speak again. We just sat, two enemies sharing a fragile truce, held hostage by the storm. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space, a territory we were both cautiously exploring. Every so often his breathing would catch, a small, hitched sound he tried to disguise as a sigh. Each time, it sent a jolt through my system. A bizarre, protective instinct I couldn't name and didn't want to examine. I was losing control. The carefully drawn lines were blurring, washed away by the relentless storm, and I was terrified of the blank, uncharted map that lay beneath. The cabin grew colder as the night deepened. The state-of-the-art heating system was fighting a losing battle against the sheer force of the blizzard pressing in on us. The wind shrieked, rattling the window panes in their frames. It sounded like something alive, something furious, trying to get in. I got up to add another log to the fire. The wood pile was on the hearth, and as I bent down, my shoulder brushed against Theodore's knee. It was nothing. An accidental, incidental contact. A meaningless friction of wool against wool. But it felt like a brand. A current of heat shot up my arm, short-circuiting every rational thought in my brain. I froze for a fraction of a second, my hand hovering over a piece of split birch. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to register it. But I could feel the radiating warmth of his body, a stark contrast to the chill in the air. It was a gravitational pull, a silent invitation to stay in his orbit. I snatched a log and shoved it into the fire with more force than necessary, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. I retreated to my end of the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an accident. It means nothing. The mantra looped in my head, a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall he had just breached, without even trying. I risked a glance at him. He was still staring into the flames, but his posture had changed. He was leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. The picture of casual contemplation, except his knuckles were white. He felt it too. The realization landed in my gut like a stone. This wasn't one-sided. The pressure in the room, the invisible current humming between us, it wasn't just my own hyper-analytical mind playing tricks on me. It was real. It was shared. This knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. Another hour crawled by. The whiskey I had offered sat untouched on the bar. The tablet in my lap was dark. My pretense of work, of normalcy, was gone. There was only the fire, the storm, and the charged space between us. My internal monologue was a chaotic spiral. I was analyzing every breath he took, every shift in his weight. His scent had woven itself into the fabric of the room, a constant reminder of his proximity. Sandalwood and something else. Something uniquely him. Something like ozone after a lightning strike. He finally moved, stretching his arms over his head with a quiet groan. The gray sweater pulled taut across his chest, and for a moment, I let my eyes trace the lines of his shoulders, the solid strength of him. It was an involuntary act of appreciation, a purely aesthetic observation that felt like a profound betrayal of our long-held enmity. He stood up. I'm turning in, my entire body tensed. Okay. The word was a clipped, brittle thing. He walked towards the stairs, his steps slow, weighted. He paused at the bottom, his hand on the newel post. He didn't turn around. Liam, he said. My name. He never used my name without a title. It was always Mr. or my surname, spoken like a curse in boardrooms. Hearing it now, in this quiet, firelit space, felt like he'd reached across the room and laid a hand on my chest. Yeah? My voice was a rasp. He hesitated. The wind howled, filling the silence. I could hear him take a breath. Thanks. For the fire. Then he was gone, disappearing up the stairs into the darkness of the loft. I sat there for a long time, my hands clenched into fists on my knees. Thanks for the fire. It was such a simple, meaningless phrase. A common courtesy. But in the minimalist, subtext-heavy language we had developed over years of rivalry, it felt like a confession, an admission of need, a crack in his own armor. And through that crack, I could see something I had never allowed myself to see before. A reflection of my own profound, desperate loneliness. The thought was so dangerous, I immediately recoiled from it. I stood up, my movements jerky and uncoordinated, and began to pace. Back and forth in front of the hearth, a caged animal in a cage of my own making. The fortress was crumbling. The lie of our professional rivalry was exposed as the fragile, pathetic thing it was. All that was left was the truth. 2 men in a cabin in a storm, and a terrifying magnetic pull that threatened to bring all my walls crashing down. I didn't sleep. I lay in the ridiculously large bed, listening to the storm and the sounds of the house, and the sounds of the man upstairs. I could hear the floorboards creak as he paced, a restless energy mirroring my own. I could hear him sigh, a sound of such profound weariness that it resonated deep in my own bones. Sometime around 3 a.m., a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. A sharp crack, followed by a deep, groaning tremor that shook the entire cabin. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died. We were plunged into absolute darkness. The emergency generator didn't kick in. The fire I had so carefully tended had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a faint, demonic red light that barely reached the edges of the hearth. The silence that followed the power outage was a different kind of silence. It was absolute. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the electronics, the whisper of the heating system, all gone. All that remained was the wind and the frantic thumping of my own blood in my ears. And then a sound from upstairs. A sharp, choked gasp. Theodore, I called out into the oppressive blackness. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the room. No response. I heard a thud, then the sound of ragged, uneven breathing. It was too fast. Way too fast. My body moved before my brain could object. I was out of bed, fumbling for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers clumsy with a sudden, cold dread. I switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting a stark, white path through the darkness. I took the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time. Theodore! The loft was an open space, dominated by another massive bed. The flashlight beam found him immediately. He was on the floor, curled on his side, his back pressed against the base of the bed. His knees were drawn up to his chest, his hands tangled in his hair, pulling. His whole body was shaking. The invincible man. The corporate predator. The rival I had spent years building defenses against. He was breaking apart in the dark, at the mercy of a storm inside him that was far more violent than the one outside. All the rules, all the boundaries, all the years of carefully cultivated animosity evaporated in an instant. They were meaningless constructs in the face of this raw, terrifying vulnerability. I moved toward him slowly, my feet silent on the thick rug. "Hey," I said softly, keeping my voice low and steady. "It's just a power outage." He didn't seem to hear me. His breathing was a desperate, frantic panting. A panic attack. I'd seen one before, years ago. A junior analyst during a market crash. I knew the signs. I knelt in front of him, keeping a few feet of distance. I lowered the flashlight beam so it wasn't shining directly in his face, illuminating the space between us in a soft, indirect glow. "Theodore," I said again, my voice firm but quiet. "Look at me." His head snapped up. His eyes were wide, unfocused, shimmering with a frantic terror. In the stark light of the phone, I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tremor in his hands. He looked like a cornered animal. He looked lost. My carefully guarded heart, the one I kept locked in a fortress of logic and control, cracked wide open. The instinct to protect, to shield, to anchor him was so overwhelming it was a physical force. It swept away every last remnant of my self-preservation. My role had just been irrevocably reversed. I was no longer the observer. I was the one who had to act. I had to get him out of the storm. "I'm here," I said, the words feeling both inadequate and profoundly true. "You're not alone." He just stared at me, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow bursts. He was drowning in the dark, and my hand was the only one on the edge of the pool. The air between us was a live wire. Every instinct screamed at me to maintain distance, to protect the last vestiges of my isolation. But seeing him like this, shattered, exposed, the confident facade completely dismantled, it rewired my entire operating system. The rivalry was a game we played in the light, in the dark, in the storm. It was just noise. "Can you breathe with me?" I asked. It wasn't a question. It was a plea, a command. "Let me help you." He shook his head, a tiny, frantic motion. A choked sob escaped his lips, a sound of such utter despair it felt like a physical blow. "Can't," he rasped, the word broken. "The walls closing in." The classic language of panic. His mind was his own prison now. I had to break the rules. Not the rules of our rivalry, those were already dust. I had to break my own rules. The ones that had kept me safe and alone my entire adult life. Don't get involved, don't get close, don't touch. I shuffled forward on my knees, closing the space between us until my knees were almost touching his. The heat coming off his body was frantic, febrile. I could smell his sweat, sharp and salty, laced with the fading scent of sandalwood and a new, acrid smell of pure fear. "Okay," I said, my voice a low murmur. "Okay. No breathing. Just listen to my voice. Can you do that? Focus on my voice." He gave a jerky nod, his eyes still wide and lost. "Good. That's good, Theodore." I kept my tone even, a metronome against the chaotic rhythm of his panic. "You're in the cabin, on the floor. The power is out. There's a blizzard. You are safe. The walls are not moving. I talked him through the physical reality of the room, naming objects, describing the sound of the wind, grounding him in the tangible world when his mind was betraying him. It was a technique I'd read about somewhere, filed away as useless data until this very moment. His breathing hitched, stuttered, but it didn't slow. He was still caught in the feedback loop of terror. There was one last barrier to cross. The final, most heavily fortified wall I had. The rule of physical contact. My hand was shaking as I lifted it. The air felt thick, charged with a decade of unspoken tension, of animosity, of a strange, unacknowledged magnetism. Placing my hand on him would be an irreversible act, a confession, a surrender. I chose to surrender. I laid my hand flat on his chest, right over his hammering heart. The moment my palm made contact with the soft cashmere of his sweater, two things happened at once. A violent shudder racked his entire body, a jolt of pure, terrified surprise. And a current, white-hot and powerful, shot up my arm, straight into my own chest. It felt like grabbing a live wire. It felt like coming home. "Feel that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I pressed down, a firm, grounding pressure. "That's my hand. I'm right here. I'm real." Under my palm, I could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of his heart. I could feel the heat of his skin through the fabric. I could feel the tremors that shook him. He squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the light stubble on his cheek. His breathing was still a mess, but the frantic edge was beginning to soften, just slightly. He wasn't pulling away. In fact, if I wasn't mistaken, he was leaning into my touch. Just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. "Focus here," I commanded softly. "Focus on the pressure, on my hand." I began to breathe, slowly and deliberately. In through the nose, out through the mouth. I exaggerated the sound of it, making it the dominant noise in the small, dark space. "Match me," I said. "Just try." He tried. His first few attempts were ragged, gasping things. But then, a breakthrough. One of his breaths started to sync with mine. Then another. The rhythm was clumsy, broken, but it was there. We were building a bridge across the chaos. Under my hand, his heart began to slow its frantic pace. The tremors subsided from a violent shaking to a faint vibration. He opened his eyes again. This time, they were focused. They were on me. The terror was receding, replaced by a raw, bottomless exhaustion. And something else. Something that looked like disbelief. Like wonder. He was seeing me. Not the rival. Not the stoic observer. Me. The man who had crossed the room in the dark to put a hand on his chest and breathe with him. The silence that fell between us was no longer empty. It was full of the sound of our breathing, slowly finding a shared rhythm. It was full of the weight of my hand on his chest. It was full of a truth so immense and terrifying that neither of us dared to give it a name. His own hand came up, slow and hesitant, and covered mine. His fingers were cold, but his grip was surprisingly strong. He wasn't pushing me away. He was holding me there. He was anchoring himself to me. The conscious choice had been made. The final threshold was crossed. There was no going back to the way we were. The old world, with its boardrooms and rivalries, felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream. The only thing that was real was the dark, the storm, and the desperate, grounding connection of our hands over his slowly steadying heart. I didn't know how long we stayed like that, kneeling on the floor in the loft, tethered by a single point of contact. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the before, the years of distance and armor, and the now. His breathing had evened out completely, falling into a deep, slow rhythm that matched my own. The tension had bled out of his frame, leaving him slumped and heavy against the bed. His hand was still covering mine, his grip no longer desperate, but possessive. A silent, unspoken statement. Don't go. I wouldn't have, even if he'd asked. Leaving felt like a physical impossibility, like trying to walk away from my own center of gravity. Cold, he finally murmured. His voice was a wreck, raw and scraped. It was a fact. The temperature in the cabin was dropping steadily. The embers in the fireplace downstairs would be dead by now. But it was also more than that. It was a confession of need, wrapped in a single, simple word. I know, I said. Let's get you off the floor. Moving felt like breaking a spell. I slowly retracted my hand, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. His fingers tightened for a second, before letting go. I used the light from my phone to guide us. I helped him to his feet. He was unsteady, leaning on me more than he probably realized. The brief contact of his side pressed against mine sent another jolt through my system. I ignored it. I had to. The analytical part of my brain was trying to reboot, to file this all away under some logical heading, but it kept failing. There was no precedent for this. The fire's out. I stated the obvious, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bed downstairs. It's warmer, closer to the hearth. We can pile the blankets. I was rambling, filling the silence with logistics, because the emotional truth of the situation was too enormous to confront. I was offering a practical solution to an emotional cataclysm. He didn't argue. He just nodded, a silhouette in the bouncing beam of my flashlight. He followed me down the spiral staircase like a ghost, his steps uncertain. The main room was like a cavern, colder and darker than the loft. I led him to the massive bed in the master suite. The air was frigid. I pulled back the heavy duvet and gestured for him to get in. He hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the bed, a statue of indecision. The vulnerability was back in his posture, the uncertainty. The CEO was gone, and in his place was just Theodore, a man stripped bare by fear and exhaustion. Get in, I said, my tone softer than I intended. He obeyed, sliding under the covers, still fully dressed in his sweater and trousers. He curled onto his side, facing away from me, making himself as small as possible in the vastness of the bed. I went back to the living room and gathered every blanket and throw I could find. I piled them on top of him. He didn't move. I wasn't sure if he was asleep or just pretending to be. I stood there, watching the mound of blankets rise and fall with his slow, even breaths. I should have gone to the sofa. It was the logical, appropriate thing to do. It would reestablish a boundary, however fragile. It would be a retreat to a semblance of the old order. But the thought of leaving him alone in the dark felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of the promise I had made, with the pressure of my hand on his chest. I'm right here. The lie, the initial premise of our enforced separation, was gone. The truth was that I didn't want to go to the sofa. The truth was that the magnetic pull was stronger than ever. The truth was that my own loneliness was a vast, cold cavern, and for the first time, someone else had stumbled into it with me. I walked around to the other side of the bed. My heart was a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. This was it. The final surrender. A conscious, deliberate act of dismantling the fortress, stone by stone, and walking out into the unprotected wilderness. I slid under the covers, the sheets shockingly cold against my skin. The bed was so large that a significant distance still separated us. But it wasn't enough. The space felt charged, humming with everything that had happened, with everything that remained unsaid. I lay on my back, staring up at a ceiling I couldn't see. I could hear his breathing, feel the faint vibration through the mattress with every slow exhale. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then he moved. He rolled over, slowly, deliberately, to face me. I couldn't see his expression in the pitch black, but I felt the shift in the air, the focus of his attention. I turned my head on the pillow. We were two patches of warmth in a sea of cold, our faces only inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I could smell the lingering scent of his skin, of salt and fear, and something fundamentally Theodore. Why? He whispered, his voice a ghost in the dark. The question hung between us, heavy with 1,000 potential meanings. Why did you help me? Why are you here? Why are you doing this? My analytical brain, the one that always had an answer, a strategy, a logical explanation, was silent. It had nothing. All it had was a single, terrifying, undeniable truth. Because I couldn't not, I whispered back. It was the most honest thing I had said in a decade. He was silent for a long moment. I felt more than saw him process that. Then his hand moved under the blankets, searching. His fingers brushed against my forearm. It was a tentative, questioning touch. I didn't pull away. I uncurled my own hand and met his. Our fingers intertwined, a seamless, shocking fit. His hand was still cold, but mine was warm. We were an exchange of heat, of grounding reality in the absolute dark. This was the climactic embrace. Not a desperate hug, not a passionate kiss. Just this. The simple, profound, earth-shattering intimacy of holding hands in the dark. It was a confession, a treaty, a pact. It was the complete and total collapse of all walls. He squeezed my hand. A gentle, grateful pressure. And with that, we fell asleep. Adrift in the cold and the dark, anchored only to each other. I woke to silence. Not the oppressive, charged silence of the night before, but a deep, peaceful stillness. The wind had died. The world outside the window was a blanket of pure, unbroken white, bathed in the soft, gray light of dawn. The storm was over. The first thing I became aware of was the warmth. I was cocooned in it. The second was the weight. A heavy arm was slung across my waist, and a solid presence was pressed against my back. Theodore. Sometime in the night we had gravitated towards each other, two bodies seeking heat and solace. He had shifted from his side to mine, his front pressed against my back, his arm holding me in place. His breathing was a warm, steady puff against the back of my neck. Our legs were tangled together under the mountain of blankets. My hand was still clutching his, our fingers locked together, pressed between our bodies. My analytical mind came online with a jolt, trying to process the sheer volume of sensory data. The texture of his cashmere sweater against my bare arm, the weight of his thigh resting over mine, the intimate sound of his deep, sleeping breaths, the scent of him, no longer sharp with fear, but warm, musky, and fundamentally male. Panic should have been the logical response. A frantic retreat, a desperate untangling of limbs to reestablish the boundaries so catastrophically annihilated. But there was no panic. There was only a profound, bone-deep sense of rightness. of peace. The fortress hadn't just been breached, it had been leveled. And in its place, something new and fragile and terrifyingly real had been built. This wasn't about rivalry or business or power. This was something far more fundamental. I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to break the spell. I was a scientist observing a newly discovered phenomenon, except I was also part of the experiment. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for years, a cold, hollow ache in my chest, was gone. In its place was this warmth, this weight, this connection. I had spent my life believing that strength was about building walls, about self-containment, about stoic independence. I had been wrong. I had confused armor for strength. True strength, I was beginning to realize, was this: the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone in, the courage it took to hold someone in the dark and to let them hold you back. He began to stir behind me, a low murmur in his sleep. His arm tightened around me for a moment, a reflexive, possessive gesture. Then he went still. He was awake. The silence in the room was suddenly different. It was aware. He knew where he was. He knew who he was holding. I could feel the tension return to his body, the dawning horror of the morning light. The CEO was rebooting, and he was horrified by the data logs from the night before. I braced myself for the inevitable recoil, the hasty retreat, the awkward, mumbled apology before we both pretended this never happened. Retreating to our respective corners to rebuild our walls, thicker and higher than before. But he didn't move. He didn't pull his arm away. He didn't untangle his legs from mine. He didn't let go of my hand. He just lay there, pressed against my back, breathing. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken questions. What now? Where do we go from here? How do we pretend to be enemies in the boardroom after we have been this? Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble against my spine. Liam. Just my name. But it held the entire weight of the night. The panic, the fear, the comfort, the surrender. I'm here, I answered, my own voice quiet. There was another long pause. I could feel the conflict in him, the war between his ingrained pride and the raw, undeniable truth of our new reality. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just a simple, profound acknowledgement. It was everything. I squeezed his hand. It was the only answer I could give. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity. 2 rivals, 2 men, existing in a new state of quiet understanding. The sun was climbing higher, its light growing stronger, promising a return to the world we knew. But that world no longer seemed real. Eventually, the sound of a snowplow in the distance broke the stillness. Rescue was coming. The bubble was about to burst. With a quiet sigh, he slowly, reluctantly, withdrew. The loss of his warmth was immediate, a sudden, shocking cold against my back. He sat up, and I heard the rustle of the blankets as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. I didn't move. I lay there, facing the other way, giving him the space to collect himself, to reassemble the pieces of his armor. I could hear him run a hand through his hair, the sound of a deep, shaky breath. I finally rolled over. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, his shoulders slumped. The indomitable Theodore, looking anything but. The unspoken pact was forming between us. We wouldn't talk about it. Not now. maybe not ever. But we wouldn't forget it. We couldn't. This was a part of our story now, the foundation upon which everything else would have to be rebuilt. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the transformed world. "Looks like we survived," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I sat up, the cold air hitting my chest. I looked at his back, at the strong, solid lines of him, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the blizzard. "Yeah," I said. "We did. We were no longer rivals. I didn't know what we were, but we were a we. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in my fortress. Because the fortress was gone. All that was left was the man who had seen it crumble, and who had stayed with me in the ruins. Strength wasn't the walls we built. It was the space we created for someone else to fall apart, and the courage to fall apart with them."